talking about a band I know pretty well, the Kinks. I spent probably as much time listening to the Kinks Chronicle, which was a greatest hits album of the Kinks, which basically spanned their work in the 60s and 70s, didn't really touch on their 80s stuff quite a bit growing up. They were part of my formative education from various music lovers that did live through the 60s, who were pointing me in a certain direction. So my familiarity with the Kinks coming in was pretty strong. They're a really fascinating band, and before I get into a little bit of who the Kinks are, I will say that this is, in terms of best ever albums, this is the 9th ranked album of 1966, the year that it came out, and the 903rd ranked overall. It will rank as the 5th highest Kinks album on the list as it currently stands, which means that in the 60s and 70s, later on in this run of 60s albums in the 70s, we're going to be seeing more of the Kinks. So as I bio them right here, I think that we're going to stay away from the later period, and we're going to really focus on the period leading up to this album. Just a little bit of an overview, though, about the Kinks. For those of pretty much everybody, I think, knows the song "You Got Me" by the Kinks, and probably songs like "All Day and All Night." That represents what I would consider to be the first of pretty much 5 distinct periods for the Kinks, and it's fascinating because the Kinks really are 5 different bands. Their first 3 albums, they're basically a 3-chord garage rock British invasion band. They're actually pretty extremely heavy for the time that they came up too. In 1963 to 1965, people weren't playing this big in that era as much, and so that's where a lot of the songs that you might be most familiar with, if you don't know the Kinks at all, would have come from. That's, as I said before, "You Got Me," "All Day and All the Night," a Louie Louie cover, "Where Have All the Good Times Gone." This album will represent a 2-album piece that pretty much is called the observational period for Ray Davies. And we'll talk about the band members in a second, but this is considered the beginning of their golden era. And so band version 2 and 3 are sort of their golden era. This is where they start doing observational songwriting, more orchestral, lush productions. That's going to be a 2-album concept. And then they're going to go into 10 albums, believe it or not, because there's a couple double albums in there in the 70s where they were basically releasing concept albums. That's going to be where you hear tracks like Lola and Autumn Almanac and other songs that sort of broke into the mainstream at that point. That would probably be their most critically acclaimed period in terms of the earlier albums of that, and probably where they took the most flack as well for the back-end concept albums. Those albums tend to be very polarizing, especially the ones on the back end for the Kinks. By the late 70s, they're making 3 albums. They're basically, arena rock and album-oriented rock. And then by the 80s and even one album in the 90s, they're a pop band doing new wave. And they had a pretty big hit called "Come Dancing" off an album in the 80s. And they were sort of able to reinvent themselves like chameleons over the course of 3.5 decades, which you don't see very often. For reference, the thing that is consistent for the Kinks is the Davies brothers. You got Ray Davies, who's the lead singer and the head songwriter, and then you got Dave Davies, who's the lead guitarist. In every version of the Kinks, throughout all of them, they are the consistent pieces of the band. For this particular album, Mick Avery is going to be on the drums, and Pete Waif is going to be on the bass, and they were the band pretty much from 1965 to 1969. So that second album period that we talked about and the beginning of the concept album part, that's going to be a steady lineup for the Kinks. Band name was chosen because basically they were trying to figure out something that would make them stand out and kind of describe their aggressive and stripped down style. They figured it sounded kinky, or it had some kinkiness to it, so they became the Kinks. And heading into this album, there's probably 2 things that really inform this album quite a bit. The first, and this is going to be a trend for quite a few artists that I'm going to be covering in the next couple of weeks. Ray Davies had pretty much the equivalent of a nervous breakdown heading into this album. Constant touring, songwriting pressure. Just a lot of the artists in this time period were putting a lot of pressure on themselves with their different contemporaries, whether it be the Beatles or the Byrds, Dylan in the background, the Beach Boys. You have a lot of different bands competing for the same audience and really pushing. So in between that first period and this period, Ray Davies' songwriting changed that more observational style, but he was also coming off of a period of being laid up and not touring. And then the second thing is the Kinks were actually banned from touring America and actually entering America for a 4-year period from 1965 to 1969. So the Kinks did not sell very well in America because obviously from that period, you couldn't just have, Spotify or streaming services, or even, this is still 15 years before there's even MTV. And so a lot of the way that you heard about bands was being on in America at least, was being on American television shows and getting American radio airplay. And from 1965 to 1969, the Kinks were basically persona non grata on both of those platforms. So you've got this album being released sort of into the ether in America. It did very well in Great Britain and Europe and Australia and New Zealand, where the Kinks still did have a presence. But it's never 100% known why they were banned from America. It was thought that they had rowdy shows, and there was an incident on the Dick Clark show, the predecessor to American Bandstand, that apparently was sort of the last straw. But yeah, for 4 years, they could not tour America. So that's a little bit of the insight coming into this album. I think from a bio perspective, we're going to be talking plenty about the Kinks over future episodes, so we'll kind of leave it there. Let's go into initial thoughts. Maybe let's start with Matt. Matt, what were your thoughts on this album?
So I first, it's funny that you talk about being banned, because I was in hearing your intro, I was reminded that the first time I was ever made aware of the Kinks was through a song by the Two Live Crew, who used part of "All Day and All of the Night" for "One and One," which is a filthy song that I think I heard in the second grade, which my parents would have done, like, been doing flipping out over that if they knew that I was listening to that at the time. But so yeah, I think I didn't really know any songs on this album, and I didn't really know any of their history or anything like that. I did like it. I think that it definitely sounded a little bit more adventurous. It wasn't just, like you said, the early part of the band was British Invasion stuff, kind of very basic rock and roll. This is a little bit more involved, in depth, more production, and I was reminded again of songs like, I think, "Rainy Day in June," when you talk about effects that they were doing in the '60s. Like they said, "Hey, we're singing a song about a rainy day in June. Let's throw some thunder and lightning and raindrops in the production, as if people don't know what we're talking about." So, so that was kind of playing up to what you were talking about last week, John, about effects. But I listened to this album several times, as I did all of these albums this week. It's pretty much all I was listening to all week to really try to get into it. And overall, I liked it a lot. I think there was good variety in here. They used some interesting instrumentation. I don't know if that's the harpsichord or if that's like a synthesizer to make it sound like a harpsichord, but that was prominent in several songs. And I also am picking up on another thing with some of these artists. A term that I've come across in researching the Byrds, which is, I don't know if it's pronounced raga or raga, which is basically rock that is influenced by Indian music, most notably the sitar. And so on a song like, I think it's "Fancy" on this, which is a very kind of like, raga influenced song, that a lot of artists were doing at that time. So I learned about that, which was kind of interesting. But overall, I liked it. And I was glad to kind of learn more about it. I don't know if I kick it over to Josh and talk about just initial impressions, I guess, and maybe we can talk about songs in a bit, or.
Yeah, it really comes right out the gate in that first song, sounding like a Beatles song, early Beatles song, which, coincides with that British Invasion sound. But then it really kind of, I was trying to listen to the lyrics more this go around after we talked about it last week. And, the Kinks seem a bit more playful with their lyrics, and they're a bit more cheeky, I think. And I also noticed a lot more maybe like class commentary in terms of songs, in Britain. And this is the first British band that we've listened to for the podcast, so that was interesting also. Kind of an international mix this week, actually. And yeah, I really appreciated the variety of it, and they write great songs. These songs are really catchy. "Sunny Afternoon" is a classic, obviously, and I enjoyed it. Did "Sunny Afternoon" come out as a single before this album was released? Do you know?
I don't off the top of my head, to be quite honest. I'll tell you one thing that has always come out with the Kinks has been that they write about sexually ambiguous characters quite a bit. And I think a lot of people know the song Lola, which at the time was considered to be sort of a controversial topic when it came up. But there was some of that even as early as this album, which kind of surprised me because I thought that was a piece of the Kinks in terms of their concept albums that they kind of revisited quite a bit. But even on this album, as early as Party Line, they start to tip into some of that lyrical content. And I think that the Kinks have always described themselves as a quintessentially British band. And when you think about it, it makes sense because if you're basically out of commission in America, right? You're not being able to tour there. It makes sense that you would sort of double down on your Britishness because you're really not playing for the crowds in America at that point. And so I think it really comes out in a lot of these songs because the Kinks sound like a definitively British band in the way that, while the Beatles and some other bands do as well, you can see them also ebbing a little bit into sort of an American style as well to hedge the bets. But you never lose sight of the fact that the Kinks are a British band at any point, I'd say.
Yeah, you definitely hear that in the songs.
Yeah. I particularly, I don't know if we're going into songs and stuff, but it's interesting you brought up Sunny Afternoon, and I'm trying to listen to these albums blindly for the first. If I don't know the album, I don't want to read about it. I don't want to know any background. I just want to listen to the album and go through my overall impressions. And oddly enough, I found myself listening to Sunny Afternoon, and I was kind of nonplussed by it. I was just. And I don't know if it was part of the chorus and the way that the descending chords that were going down and within the chorus. But as I listened to it more, I think I did appreciate that a little bit more. And I think I was asking you, John, about it, and you were saying it's known as maybe one of the more complex or one of the more the better arrangements or better songs that Ray Davies had written.
It's really the songwriting, I think, is what it very much encapsulates what he became as a songwriter in the second period. That would be why I'd say it's one of the... But you see it across a lot of songs, so probably it doesn't stand out as much listening to it some 40-odd years later. But when you think of it as a lead single for this album, it would be the first time you'd be exposed to how he's writing songs. And I think you're familiar enough with what the garage rocky British invasion Kinks sounded like you could imagine when you hear Sunny Afternoon after you used the You Got Me or a Louie Louie cover. It's going to sound different.
Were the Kinks as popular in Britain as the Beatles were? Are they like 1 and 2? Or
no? It's hard to say in that era because you have to remember that for as popular as the Beatles were, the charts in the 60s were all over the place in terms of what people were listening to. And Matt, you probably can tap in on this as well, but I've always thought that the Beatles were as popular, if not more popular, in America than they were in Great Britain in many ways.
Yeah, I don't know how you measure that aside from like album sales, but they were just huge everywhere, So I don't know if you can say that they were more popular here versus there. But yeah, the Kinks. That's interesting that they were. I'm really interested in why they were banned from the U.S. And I was hoping that I'd get an answer, but it's kind of weird that there's not really a known reason why. That just seems kind of arbitrary.
Their shows were apparently pretty chaotic.
But the Beatles were just as. I mean, the Beatles were crazy too. They were afraid that they were going to get shot. Well,
I think it's the personal conduct on stage. So if we think of it as an extension of what sort of 70s and 80s rock would be, that decadent lifestyle a little bit. The Kinks, while not at that level, like a Motley Crue, Kiss, 70s Aerosmith level, they were sort of known for destroying kind of what The Who became known for later, destroying their instruments. The Kinks were doing that a few years earlier. And they were kind of known for also being a little bit more aggressive in terms of their communication. That seems to be what people have tied it to. But like I said before, there hasn't been a formal description, and probably never will be, because there's really no need, I think, to revisit that if they haven't right now. But yeah, and so that to answer your question, I think a little bit, Josh, it's very difficult to make a comparison because when you don't have a real audience in America who's being able to be exposed to you in the way that, say, the Beatles were being put on so many platforms and making transcendent music as well. But, it's very difficult to rank the field because,
I'm also curious as to who banned them, right? Like, what agency banned? Was it the Feds?
The American Recording Association.
Oh.
Was actually, Mm-hmm.
Oh, it wasn't even like a government or a police. It was just, geez.
Nope.
Interesting. That's very interesting.
And remember, we're talking about the payola era still very much in this. So, when you're off the radio and you're not touring, it's basically, game over. But I do want to say that, what the Kinks, as a quintessentially, I think, British sounding band, I'm going to throw a deep cut in here, right here. They remind me a little bit of, later in the 70s, you started having bands like the Buzzcocks that were like a very British punk band. Now there was, the Sex Pistols and the Clash as well, but they kind of transcended. They could just as much have been in many ways from New York as they were from Great Britain. But the Buzzcocks, they wrote songs about everyday British life. And there would always be in the 70s and 80s and 90s certain bands that were inherently British, and you start to see that in the 90s as well with Oasis and Blur, right? Where Oasis grabbed a little bit more for the American market, where Blur and Pulp very much stayed more in the British lane in some ways. So I think they're the beginning of that type of transition as well. Just something to think about there. So,
what were some of your do you have any favorite songs on this album, John?
I really I think Sunny Afternoon's a great song. I mean, it stands out even in the greatest hits collections for them. There was a double shot of A House in the Country and Holiday in Waikiki I really liked, and they represent the end of what would have been side one on the traditional album, and I think it was Holiday in Waikiki was a pretty funny song, and A House in the Country was a very different song, very guitar driven. The thumping drums, the tambourine, and it just hits you right in the front of the track. So I really enjoyed that combination of two songs. It's also interesting they put Sunny Afternoon so deep in the album. You would think that they would front load it, but it just sort of shows up many songs down in the album. It's just interesting placement.
Yeah, definitely. It's at the bottom almost, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would probably. It's interesting. I go a little bit different as far as standout tracks for me, and maybe I think that this is an album though. Upon further listening, I think this is something I could see me seeing more and hearing more into it as it goes on. But I think ones that stand out, the ones that I was most excited to hear as they came up again or to go back to, I really like Dandy. I thought that was like the driving guitar part of that was really upbeat and very catchy. And I really liked the last track, I'll Remember. I thought that was kind of an interesting, song to end with. But again, those are more like, I think that those on the surface for me were catchier. And I think that something like A Sunny Afternoon, and I think Rainy in June a little bit too might be something that, would come in a little bit. I more as time goes on. So, and I think the only song that I was really like meh on was Session Man. I don't know. It just seemed, I don't know. I didn't really like the hook. I think it was kind of just out there.
Repetitive, wasn't it?
Yeah. And it just, every time I listened to it, I was like, like, I don't think I'm going to like the opposite. I don't think I'm going to get more into this I think that's pretty much what it is. Yeah. But,
I don't really love, it's funny because the two tracks you like felt to me like Organ Basement, sitar, the raga that you talked about, and sometimes it feels like everybody went on the same trip in the 60s, but some people had a better musical outcome from the trip that they took. And I felt like Dandy in particular, the lyrics, and I know you're not a lyrics guy as much as I am, but the lyrics they do not stand out in a very lyrically strong album. Yeah.
Yeah, he's just a guy running around with a bunch of chicks, right? Like the guy that's like the ladies' man kind of a thing. But that's what I gravitate towards. It's just that the guitar and just like the strumming of it, the fast-paced nature of it, I just found it very catchy. So, I enjoyed listening to that.
Josh, what about you? Any tracks that stood out for you?
I think I really liked Rosie, Won't You Please Come Home. I liked Little Miss Queen of Darkness. I think I just like those really catchy songs those melodies that they write. Those stood out to me. I like Rainy Day in June a lot too. So
Those are the bluesier songs for sure, I think, too. The ones you identified. It's just interesting as I look at my notes. Those two songs you mentioned at first, Josh, I said are the bluesiest songs on the album. So you've kind of got Matt gravitating to more of the psychedelic, not truly, because the Kinks aren't right true psychedelic, but, a little bit more of those Eastern influences. Josh is going to the bluesy stuff, and I think that probably I'm gravitating a little bit more to the lyrics here for the Kinks. For me personally, I know the Kinks discography pretty well. I would put this as a good but not great album for the Kinks. There will be great ones coming later, where I think they kind of put a little bit more of it together. And I think I even like some of the earlier Kinks better, maybe not in totality, but the visceral energy of the Kinks just really stands out, especially when you listen to other albums from 1963 to 1964 in comparison. You can really see that they're trendsetters at that point. At this point, I wouldn't say that they're making generic music, because they're not, but I wouldn't say that they're at that trendsetter point anymore for me personally. Josh, what about you? Would you recommend this album? What would you tell somebody who asked you about it?
I think there's something for everyone on this album, and I found it really easy to listen to. Multiple times I listened to it, just like Matt and you did, I'm sure. And I don't know if it's the best starting point for the Kinks, but it's definitely a good album.
Great. How about you, Matt?
I think it's hard for me to compare it to other albums because I don't really know any other Kinks albums. I know singles, so I thought it was good. It wasn't amazing. I do agree with Josh. It's a pretty easy listen overall. I don't think it's terribly challenging or anything like that. I think it was solid. I have no qualms with it, So I suppose in that regard, I'd recommend it. It's good to know for the Kinks, but I am interested to hear their other stuff and, their more critically acclaimed or better albums, if you will, coming down the line. I'm excited about that.
Gotcha. I'd probably give it a slight recommend as well. I definitely think that there aren't going to be too many people who are familiar with the period who are going to walk away from this not enjoying this album. I think it will also be interesting once we do more Kinks albums in the context of having heard some of their stuff in the late 60s and the 70s, especially as we get to like Village Preservation Society and some of those albums. And I think we're also going to even come across Kinks Controversy, the album directly before this, in future charts. So maybe we can revisit it, and in future episodes we can find this episode falling in place in terms of the Kinks discography. But I think that's as good a place to put a bow on the first album. It sounds like 3 recommendations for it, varying from strong to mild, but this is one that we suggest you seek out. So